Hey everybody, I'm Silas, and welcome to Psilocybology. Let's expand our mind. This is a series where we talk about the research on psilocybin, the psychedelic prodrug found in magic mushrooms. We'll be breaking down and discussing the scientific literature, one study at a time, from past to present. If you'd like to support the show, please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Real quick announcement. Since this podcast releases 4 new episodes a month, and this month there are 5 Mondays, there will not be a new episode on the 5th Monday of the month, April 29th. I'll mention it again when we get closer, but I wanted to at least briefly let you all know ahead of time now that we're officially in the month of April. And with that, let's get into the episode. Today's episode is on the article titled LSD, Comparison with Action of Methysergide and Psilocybin on Test Subjects, published in 1965. Now, this paper is unlike the typical experimental studies we've been discussing. It's really a bit more like a compilation of 6 case studies. The primary data published in this paper, I think, could honestly best be described as the trip journals or logs of 6 participants who were studied for a period of almost 2 years. There are 6 primary tables, and each table has 5 columns, one for the experiment number, the date, the drug administered, the number of positive questionnaire responses, and any remarks or notes that the participants had about their experience. Each participant completed between 24 and 34 experiments, which took place from November of 1958 to May of 1960. We'll obviously dive into more detail about what's in these tables, but I will also include them in the episode transcript, which you can find at psilocybology.org/podcast. Before we get into the data, though, let's talk about what these authors set out to do with this manuscript. This specific manuscript is actually part of a very large series of papers published by these authors that set out primarily to examine LSD and often to compare LSD to other drugs of interest. This is the 38th publication in the series, and we've actually covered one of their papers previously when we discussed how LSD and psilocybin affect the behavior of Siamese fighting fish in episode 21. In this study, the authors chose to compare the effects of LSD, psilocybin, and Methysergide. Now, of course, most of you listening are already familiar with the psychedelics LSD and psilocybin, but let's talk about Methysergide. Methysergide, which stands for 1-methyl-D-lysergic acid butanolamide, was a drug developed to treat migraines and cluster headaches. It fell a bit out of use in the 80s, and the brand name version called Sansert was eventually discontinued in the US. The drug is still available in some parts of the world, but seems to be very rarely used. The fact that Methysergide was used to treat migraines sort of jumped out at me, because there's been some reports that LSD and psilocybin also may treat migraines and cluster headaches. This link, however, was actually not the main reason these authors chose to compare these drugs. Rather, the authors state that the reason for picking Methysergide is because it was observed that after patients were given it, they often reported side effects such as weakness, dizziness, distortions of body image, and, quote, confused feeling of unreality. The authors noted these symptoms were similar to those also seen after LSD administration. In addition, a prior experiment showed that Methysergide produced stupor in Siamese fighting fish, which was also observed after these fish were given LSD and psilocybin. These findings are what prompted this comparison study. Although they center the introduction, and even the study title, around comparing LSD, psilocybin, and Methysergide, they actually administer a number of other drugs as well. For example, in the studies conducted in April of 1960, they administered psilocin instead of psilocybin to the participants. They also occasionally administered other lysergic acid derivatives, such as 2-bromo-LSD, D-lysergic acid methylpropolamide, D-lysergic acid ethylamide, D-lysergic acid ethylpropolamide, and D-lysergic acid methylethylamide. These weren't administered very often, but they do show up, and were probably brought up in more detail in one of the other publications in the series. As for the methods, each session involved administering one of the drugs of interest 30 minutes before dinner, and participants were not told which they were given. They noted that the experiments were done together as a group, although not everyone in the group were given the same drugs, and it appears that not all 6 participants were always present for each of the experiments. What's kind of cool to stop and think about, though, is that these participants must have gotten to know each other really well, if they didn't know each other already. They spent 2 years of their lives taking psychedelics and recording their experiences together. Anyway, they then had participants complete a symptom checklist questionnaire, 30 minutes, 1.5 hours, 2.5 hours, and 3.5 hours post-drug administration. They were also asked to guess what drug they took. That's basically the entire experiment, at least as it is presented in the paper. As I mentioned earlier, participants did this between 24 and 34 times, each with varying drugs and doses. Getting into the results, this section of the paper primarily consists of 6 paragraphs, each detailing the experience of one of the 6 subjects. Let's go through the experiences of these subjects and see what the researchers observed. We won't go into every detail since I think that'd take a really long time and get a bit boring to listen to, but we'll go over the highlights. Again, the tables will be on the website if interested. The first subject had the initials JG and was a female weighing 61 kilograms. In the first set of initial experiments, JG was given 3 different lysergic acid derivatives, LSD, 2-bromo-LSD, and D-lysergic acid methylpropylamide. JG showed a positive reaction to LSD, but had no reaction to the other 2 drugs, which I believe follow-up research has also shown that those 2 drugs do not produce a psychedelic response, although could be used to treat migraines. The first time JG was given psilocybin, she was administered 6 milligrams, and her scores on the questionnaire did increase. She also guessed that she had been given 50 micrograms of LSD. For all of the participants, they used their guesses to actually try and determine equivalent doses between the 3 primary drugs of interest. Obviously, this method has its limitations, since it's very subjective, but I thought it was an interesting thought. We'll talk more about what they concluded later in the episode. The next series of tests the authors discuss that JG participated in occurred from June to July of 1959. They gave her Methysergide every day for 10 days, and then gave her 6 milligrams of psilocybin. What they noticed is that she did not respond at all to the psilocybin, indicating that there is some cross-tolerance between these 2 drugs. Similar experiments were done with the other participants as well, repeatedly showing some cross-tolerance between Methysergide and psilocybin, as well as between Methysergide and LSD. They also tested for cross-tolerance using the same method for LSD and psilocybin, and found a reduced response, if any at all, to whichever drug they administered last. This was across multiple participants. There was only one case where they repeatedly did not see cross-tolerance develop, and this was between the drug D-lysergic acid ethylamide and psilocybin. The last thing to note about JG is that at the very end she was given a placebo, and estimated she was given instead 3 to 4 milligrams of psilocybin. The authors called this a placebo-positive response, and so experiments with JG were discontinued after that point. The second participant had the initials CG, and was a male weighing 80 kilograms. They noted that prior to the official experiments conducted, they observed CG was very sensitive to LSD, so the first 2 experiments were placebo. CG reported he felt no reaction to either. The researchers also threw in another placebo after a few more experiments, and again he reported no reaction. One of the highlights they noted about CG was that, quote, his estimation of the dose of psilocybin or LSD, or equivalent doses, was remarkably accurate. Out of the 16 experiments where he was given psilocybin or LSD, he correctly guessed which he was given 10 times. There were 2 other cases where he said it could have been either, but when he guessed the dose for each, he hit the mark. For example, in one experiment he was given 35 micrograms of LSD, and he reported that he was either given 5 milligrams of psilocybin or 35 micrograms of LSD. In another trial, he was given 8 milligrams of psilocybin, and he guessed he was given either 75 micrograms of LSD or 8 milligrams of psilocybin. Jumping to the third participant, we have a male weighing 76 kilograms by the initials PB. The researchers noted that this participant also appeared very sensitive to LSD, and so when cross-tolerance developed to LSD after being given Methysergide, they took this to be a strong indicator confirming the existence of cross-tolerance. The researchers also noted that PB was concerned with an emotional problem during one of the experiments, and so withdrew from that day's trial. Participant 4 went by the initials MZ and was a male weighing 82 kilograms. One of the unique experiments done with this participant is that he was given mescaline for 7 days and then given placebo. MZ correctly reported that he felt no reaction to the placebo. What's interesting is that he's the only participant who received mescaline. Participant 5 went by RB and was another male weighing 86 kilograms. The researchers singled him out and stated that he, quote, could not distinguish between LSD and psilocybin. What I found funny, though, when looking through his trip log, was that he described 25 micrograms of LSD as, quote, like one cocktail. Finally, participant 6 went by the initials DVG and was a female weighing 68 kilograms. The authors note that her data confirm a lot of what's already been discussed, but pointed out one unique experiment that she was involved in. For 7 days straight, they gave DVG a placebo and then administered 8 milligrams of psilocybin. She correctly estimated that she was given between 6 to 8 milligrams of psilocybin. This was an interesting experiment, and I think they were curious to see if cross-tolerance was placebo-driven or not, which I have to say I don't think I would have ever thought to test that, so it was kind of cool. The very last thing I want to discuss about this brief study is that I want to loop back to the comment I made earlier about estimating equivalent doses between our primary drugs of interest. To do this, they asked participants to estimate what they felt the threshold dose was for LSD, psilocybin, and Methysergide. They then averaged those values. Participants estimated that the threshold for LSD was 25 micrograms, that the threshold for psilocybin was 3.4 milligrams, and that the threshold for Methysergide was 4.3 milligrams. Based on these values, they estimated then that 1 microgram of LSD was about equivalent to 0.14 milligrams of psilocybin and 0.17 milligrams of Methysergide. If we extrapolated that out, focusing on the comparison between LSD and psilocybin, then a 100 microgram dose of LSD would be about equivalent to 14 milligrams of psilocybin. Based on prior conversations we've had on this podcast, this seems slightly skewed toward a larger relative dose of LSD than psilocybin, but it isn't quite as bad as some of the other estimates we've come across. Given this was based on subjective data from only 6 participants, it's a better estimate than I thought it would be. Anyway, that's it for today's episode. As always, I really hope you enjoyed the show. If you have any questions, feedback, or ideas for the podcast, please let me know. You can find out all the ways to reach me on the website, psilocybology.org, where you can also find the full transcript for each episode if interested. Thank you all for listening. I'll talk to you next time.